Welcome to the recorded lesson for English Language, Paper 1, Question 3, the structure question. Now, a bit unusually for one of these recorded lessons, I'm going to start off with a bit of a fill in the blanks activity, and I'll explain why afterwards. So have a look at this. Please pause the recording for a few seconds, go through and try and fill in the blanks. I'll come back to you in about 5 seconds or so. Right, I hope you did this activity because it's very, very important that you know about narrative voice, and we'll go on to that in a few moments. But in the meantime, these are the words that hopefully you got. Refers to the perspective from which a story is told, shaping the reader's experience and understanding. First person narrative uses I or we, offering a personal view, as seen in classics like The Catcher in the Rye. Second person narrative using you directly addresses the reader, creating an immersive experience, though it is less common. Third person narrative, which uses he, she or they, can be omniscient or limited, restricted to one character's thoughts. For instance, Pride and Prejudice employs an omniscient narrator, while Harry Potter mainly uses a third person limited perspective. Narratives can also be objective, where the narrator reports only what is observable, or the opposite of that, subjective, where thoughts and feelings are shared. An omissive narrator deliberately leaves out information, creating suspense or ambiguity, as seen in The Turn of the Screw. Narrators can be reliable. They can also be unreliable. The central narrator is the protagonist, while a peripheral narrator observes the main action. And the consummate example there being Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby. Finally, retrospective narrators reflect on past events, often with a different perspective than they had at the time. So, what you've got in that fill in the blanks activity, and as I say, I really hope you tried to do it, because if you tried to do it, what you will have done is identified those things you know and those things you don't know. Once you've identified those things you don't know, you can then do something about it. You can learn that terminology. Being able to talk really expertly and confidently about narrative voice is crucial in pretty much all literature or language study in English and in other languages as well. It comes up again and again and again, but it is particularly important for this question that we're looking at in this recorded lesson, Paper 1, Question 3. And frankly, if you don't know your narrative voice stuff, you cannot possibly access this question fully. You're going to be limiting yourself to 4 or 5 out of 8 unless you're talking pretty convincingly about narrative voice. Right, let's get on to looking at the question. This is what question 3 looks like. Key bit of information here. You now need to think about the whole source. This is the structure question, How is the whole source, the whole extract put together? We get some information here about where the source is from. It's from the beginning of the story. How has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? This is a massive, massive danger, folks, this word interest. I do not know why the exam board has written the question like this. Unfortunately, the question will always be written like this. This is the question you are going to get. It's an awful question because that word interest is a red herring. You're not really being asked what interests you about the structure of the text. What you're actually being asked is what structural methods is the writer using and how does that create meaning in the text? The way the question is asked, though, it could lead an unsuspecting student down the route of kind of constantly saying, oh, the writer has structured it like this, which I find really interesting because, well, to be honest, no one's that interested in what you find interesting. What we're interested in is how do the structural techniques create meaning. Therefore, you largely need to ignore that word, and I'll show you how to deal with that in a second. Lastly, before we go on, 8 to 10 minutes this question should take, just like paper 1, question 2, 8 marks, so you want to be getting out of there in certainly no more than 10 minutes. Right, structurally, when you look at a piece of writing, there are a series of questions that you need to ask yourself. Now, there are a lot of these questions, and it might feel a bit overwhelming at first, but we'll go through them and then I'll talk about how you can make them a little bit more manageable. We're always interested structurally in how pieces start. They set up a piece of writing for us and they arguably tell us more than anything else. In the same way, we're always interested in how things end. Is there some kind of sequence or chronology? Is flashback used, analepsis, or is prolepsis, flash forward, used? Is some kind of foreshadowing used, or perhaps pathetic fallacy? Foreshadowing, is there some kind of clue that's given as to something that might happen later? Pathetic fallacy is where the environment or the setting reflects the moods, the emotion of the characters or the plot at that time. It's not just about the weather. Please don't think it's just about the weather. That's what it's typically that's what's typically taught, and that's not entirely accurate. We're interested structurally in whether a piece starts broadly and then narrows, or does it start narrowly and then broaden? Do we have different perspectives? Do we start inside a room and then outside a room, or the other way round? What are the key moments when a piece shifts, when there is a movement from one mood perhaps to another mood? Why is it happening at that particular place? And just like with that fill in the blanks activity, what type of narration is used? And you'll see here, first, second, third, omniscient, central, etc. A lot of that key language from narrative voice. Are there some kind of repetitions used? Reiterations, threads, things that go throughout a piece, patterns or motifs? To be honest, all these things mean kind of the same thing. A motif is probably the fanciest way to talk about them. A motif is a little thing, a little idea, a little structure that keeps popping up again and again. Those of you who are musical will recognise that term from music as well. Are there some kind of links between paragraphs? Do we have some kind of circular narrative? You might call it a circular narrative, circular structure, or circularity, where there is some reference back at the end to where we started the piece. Are there any particular words or phrases that mark a particular shift? Do we have any kind of oppositional things going on, juxtapositions, things that are next to each other that shouldn't be next to each other, where there's a clash? You would call those an incongruence. Is parallelism used? How does the piece read structurally? Is it sort of chronological, linear? Does it reliably go from one thing to another? Is it stable, or is it different to that? Is it the opposite to that? And finally, does the ending raise questions that remain unanswered? So these are the kind of questions that you typically ask yourself when you're looking at a piece structurally. Now, you might well be sat there thinking, oh, that is overwhelming. I'm not going to be able to remember 15 things to go looking for. And probably you won't. What you need to do with this question, probably more than any other, is just practice doing it loads and loads of times. And the best way to practice it is to print out this slide, to print out a source, and to just go through them one at a time. Now, what you will find is that by the time you're doing that for the probably, I'm going to say, third, fourth, maybe fifth or sixth, depending on how naturally this stuff comes to you. But if you practice this between 3 and 6 times, my gut feel is that by the end of that, you will find that you don't really need to refer back to the list. You've just become familiar with the kinds of things you need to go looking for. Something you could do to help is you could have some flashcards which have the information on the screen in front of you on there. You could obviously shorten it. You could try and do some recall activities. Just write down as many things as you can remember that you might go looking for, and then refer back to the list. As I say, you might want to simplify this list first. Just pick out the key phrases: foreshadowing, pathetic fallacy, a sequence, narrative voice. Just keep trying to recall those. Do that every 2 or 3 days, and before long you would be able to recall all the things you need to go looking for. Right, so if I were to use these questions on a source, this is how I might go about it. Here we have the Rosabelle source that will be familiar to you now, particularly if you've looked at some of the recorded lessons already on question 1 and question 2 on this first paper. What I would suggest you do now is ideally have a printout of this source, and you pause the recording and you go through and you use those 15 questions and you try and find some things to talk about from a structural point of view. Now, I know that some of you aren't going to do that. You're just going to carry on listening, but honestly, the best way to get those structural questions in your head is to practice using them. So please do pause the recording. It's my last request of you. That's going to be far more useful to your learning. I'm going to go quiet for a few seconds, but then I'm going to talk about what I found interesting here. Well, few things that I picked out that are structurally interesting. First of all, we've got Rosabelle's thoughts and actions at the start of the piece, which really foreground her class and her circumstance. The fact that she's making this choice between having this bit of luxury and buying the flowers versus having some food tells us a lot about the situation that she is trapped in. We have this analeptic shift. On line 15, she began to think of all that had happened during the day, and that kind of takes us into understanding why Rosabelle is feeling the way she's feeling, and probably why she's made this decision to buy herself this rather pathetic bunch of violets. We go into a section there where we see that Rosabelle has a public persona. There's a way that she's expected to act because of her class versus what her private internal thoughts are. The focus of the piece narrows and narrows and narrows to the point where it's really focused around the interaction with the redhead girl. The redhead girl who epitomizes everything that Rosabelle wants, but everything that Rosabelle is unable to have. The dialogue there is very direct. She is kind of given these kind of short sentences. Have you any hats like that? Which again reinforces the sense of Rosabelle's status and position. She just needs to do what this girl is asking her to do. Constantly throughout the piece, we have this motif of things that Rosabelle wants versus things that she can have, and the seeming closeness of the things she wants, but the fact that they still remain unattainable to her. We've got this decision at the start between the violets and the food. She picks the bit of luxury, but really she can't have it because that means she's not going to eat. We've got this section in paragraph 2 where she is looking at these fairy palaces of jewelers' shops, but she's unable to have them. They exist on the other side of a window, and her vision of them is blurred and misty. Again, a thing she can see, it kind of seems to be within her grasp, but is unattainable to her. And then lastly, of course, we have the hat, which is, rather cruelly plonked on her head. She's told to wear it, so she's kind of experiencing it, having it, but yet it's not something that she can have completely or fully. And then lastly, there is a bit of circularity in here, a circular narrative, where we have Harry and the red-haired girl going off to have lunch. I shall go straight home and put it on before I come out to lunch with you, Rosabelle heard her say. So there we have the contrast. The red-haired girl gets to have the luxury hat and gets to have lunch. That takes us circularly back to the start, where Rosabelle has to make the decision between that rather pathetic bit of luxury, buying a bunch of violets, but then not being able to eat. Those are the structural things that I would have picked up. Now let's go on and look at the formula for this question. Right, the first thing that you need to do, paper 1, question 3, is you need to write a coat hanger sentence that summarises how the piece is structurally interesting. Now I'll come back to what we mean by a coat hanger sentence, but it's a sentence that starts your answer that you hang everything else off, hence coat hanger sentence. Now we are really clear and prescriptive about how you must start your paper 1 question 3 answers, and here it is. You have basically 2 options. But what you must talk about first of all is the overall structure of the piece. What's the overall feeling structurally of the piece? Is it linear and chronological, or is it non-chronological? Is there frequent use of flashback or flash forward, analepsis or prolepsis? Is it chaotic? The second thing you must talk about is the narrative voice. Is it a third person narrative voice? Is it omniscient? Is it limited? Is it a first person narrative voice? Which is why, as I said before, you have to be comfortable talking about narrative voice. You have to know that terminology. So you must talk about those 2 things. Now you can do it in one of 2 ways. If the overall structure and the narrative voice are kind of doing the same thing, creating the same meaning, you can do it together. And here's your first example. The extracts, and then you insert your overall structure here, so largely chronological structure, and third person limited narrative voice, are interesting as they establish how. Now at this point you would provide an overall effect. They establish how Rosabelle is trapped by her class and circumstance, for example. That's how you start every paper 1 question 3 answer. There is a second option, which is if the overall structure and the narrative voice are doing slightly different things in terms of meaning, you might want to separate the 2 things out. So the extracts, largely chronological structure, is interesting how it establishes how, blah, 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 blah. This is underpinned by the first person retrospective narrative voice that does this. So if the narrative voice and the overall structure are kind of suggesting different meanings, alternative meanings, shades of meaning, and you want to deal with them separately, you can do that. The crucial thing is though, you start off this answer by talking about the overall structure and by talking about the narrative voice and what effect they are having overall. So let's have a look at this in a bit more detail. First of all, you have to talk about the overall structure. Now, there are certain words that you are always going to use here, and there aren't many of them. The overall structure of a piece is either going to be chronological linear, in other words, it's going to proceed from one thing to another in the order that they happened, or non-linear and non-chronological, in other words, it's going to jump about a bit. Now you might get something that's particularly extreme, jumping about all over the place, and you might call that chaotic. What you're probably going to get is something that is largely chronological, but perhaps has some moments of analepsis or prolepsis, so flash back or flash forward. So those words in blue in the box at the bottom are the kinds of words you're going to use when you talk about your overall structure. Let's have a look at the second part of your coat hanger sentence, and this is when you're looking at the narrative voice. Well, you know the kind of words you're going to use here because they're the kind of words that were in that fill in the blank activity at the start of the recorded lesson. You're going to be talking about first person, second person, third person, omniscient, limited, objective, subjective, etc. Those are pretty much all the words that are pulled from that fill in the blanks activity. Not sure why when I've gone to this next slide that pops up in the middle of it. There's something gone wrong with my animation there. But let's deal now with the kind of third element of writing that coat hanger sentence. We've said that we need to talk about the overall structure. We've said we need to talk about the narrative voice. The third part of it is we now need to say what meaning comes from it. Now you'll see here I use the phrase is interesting as it establishes how. Now what you will note is I've used the word interesting. This is the nod that we give to the question. This is us saying, look, we're answering the question. You've used that stupid word interesting, and we're going to acknowledge that you've used that stupid word interesting, and we're going to directly answer that stupid word interesting by using it once in our coat hanger sentence. We are never, in paper 1 question 3, going to use the word interesting again, but we're going to acknowledge that you want us to talk about what's interesting, so we're going to use it once to show you that we've read the question. Here's some guidance as to how you go about saying why it's interesting. Well, my big advice to you here is don't think about why the overall structure is interesting or why the narrative voice is interesting, because to be honest, it won't be. There's nothing particularly interesting about the structure that a writer uses or the narrative voice a writer uses. They're all interesting, but they all do different things. What you have to do instead is you've got to think about the overall meaning of the extract. Where students can get themselves in a real pickle is they sit there thinking, why is this narrative voice interesting? Well, that's quite a hard question to answer because it's not interesting. What's interesting is the overall meaning of the piece. And what the narrative voice does and what the structure does is help create that overall meaning of the piece. So instead of thinking, why is this structure or narrative voice interesting? Just think to yourself, what does the piece mean? What's the overall theme or meaning of the piece? And if you get that, then you will know what the narrative voice and the structure is trying to create. So if we think about the Rosabelle piece, the thing that is interesting about it is this sense that she is trapped by her class, by her circumstances, and she can't escape. That meaning, that overall meaning, is created in part, in large part I would argue, by the overall structure and by the narrative voice. The fact that the person telling Rosabelle's story is not her is significant in itself. Think about the overall meaning of the piece and you will understand then what the effect of the overall structure and the narrative voice is. Again, there's something gone wrong with my animations here. I am so terribly sorry. This then is how we might write the coat hanger sentence for the Rosabelle piece. The extract's largely linear and chronological structure with one significant analeptic shift and the use of a third-person omniscient narrative voice are interesting as they established how Rosabelle is trapped by her class and circumstance and lacks the agency to escape. Agency means power or ability to escape. So I think we've covered this stuff, but why do we do this? Well, as I've already said, it deals with the word interesting. They want us to deal with the word interesting, so we have done. Structurally, in every single piece you ever read, the overall structure of it, is it linear chronological or is it not, or is there some kind of in-between state, and the narrative voice, they're always the most important things in any piece of writing, really. Even if you're looking at a whole novel, pretty much in every single novel, the two most interesting things are what's the overall structure of it and what's the narrative voice that's used. That drives more meaning than pretty much anything else in pretty much every single novel that's ever been written. So it's, if you think about those two things, you're going to write a successful answer. The other reason we do it, of course, is because it makes the rest of our answer much easier to write. If you've written a really good coat hanger sentence, you've got something else to hang everything else off. So we know how to do the formula, at least the first part of it. We write our coat hanger sentence. What do we do next? Well, hopefully you've also found 3 or 4, maybe 5 or 6 other structural methods. The moment of the analeptic shift, perhaps a motif of time. I think there is a bit of a motif of time in the Rosabelle extract. The circularity that we looked at the end of the extract. So now's your opportunity to talk about those. And you just pick one and you say, Mansfield uses a circular narrative. If you can, you try and quote. You try and pick out the bit of the extract using a very short embedded quote which highlights the bit that you're talking about. Sometimes, of course, when it comes to structural methods, there won't necessarily be a quote. You might just talk about the ending. But if you can kind of pull out the word or the phrase that indicates when something's happening, that's a good thing to do. You write about the specific effect of that method. So if you're looking at the circular narrative, we talked about how it reinforces the idea of Rosabelle being trapped by her class and circumstance, because here we have the girl who can have whatever she wants versus Rosabelle who has to make the choice. And depending how many structural methods you've found, you might repeat that process 2 to 4 times. The great thing is, if you've written your coat hanger sentence really well, you're already well on your way to getting a good mark. Like, genuinely, if you can do a really good coat hanger sentence, an accurate one, you've probably already got 4 out of 8. What you're then doing is you're just trying to add a few more marks. So, pick a couple more, maybe 3 more structural methods, quote them if you can, link the effect of them probably back to your coat hanger sentence. That's how you're going to get up to 6, 7, 8 out of 8. And of course, whether you get a 6 or whether you get an 8 will probably depend on just how well you write about the effect. So, what kind of things were we looking at in the Rosabelle extract? I won't take long on this. Thoughts and actions at the beginning, that analepsis, which then led us into that kind of public versus private thing. We've got use of time as a discourse marker, that constantly narrowing of focus till it's entirely centered around the redhead girl, directness of the dialogue. We've got that motif of Rosabelle seeing things that she can't have, and we've got the circularity. Let's have a look at how that might work in an actual answer. So here is a student's answer to this question. How does this student do? What I would recommend you do is, if you can, print off this slide, pause the recording, and then just have a look at this this answer. Maybe ask yourself how many marks it is going to get. I'm going to go quiet for a few seconds and then I will talk through it. Okay, so the answer is the student does really well. Let's have a look at the answer bit by bit. The extract's non-linear structure is interesting as it establishes how Rosabelle is locked into a life she dislikes and cannot escape because of her social status. The student here calls it a non-linear structure. I would probably say it's largely linear and chronological with one significant analeptic shift. But to be honest, both are correct, aren't they? It is a non-linear structure because there's a bit of flashback. So hopefully that shows you that as long as you're saying something that's reasonable, you're not going to get marked down for that. It's acting nicely as a coat hanger sentence because it establishes the overall effect of that structure. This student has chosen to split non-linear structure and third-person narrative voice. I personally wouldn't. They call it a limited narrative voice. I would probably argue it's an omniscient, but again, it's a reasonable thing to say because we follow Rosabelle around, so actually probably it is limited. Demonstrates Rosabelle's lack of agency and control in her life, so really good effect there. This the fact it's a third-person narrative voice is the important thing. We have this lovely use of the word anchored. We're anchored at the start of the extract when she needs to choose between the motifs of luxury and food. So first of all, we've got that use of the word anchored. That's great. Nice word for you to have in your armoury. I think I use the word foregrounded, something that comes early. It's the idea that something is anchored at the start of the text. We've also got the use of the word motif. That's a structural method. A motif, something that occurs a few times throughout an extract. Luxury and food, well, it does. Both of those things occur more than once. Mansfield uses pathetic fallacy. I didn't actually pick up on this, but it's a really good point. We've got all that kind of we've got the atmosphere as she gets on the bus in those opening paragraphs. It's kind of wet and miserable outside, and then we've got that sickening sense of warm humanity, haven't we, inside the bus, which reflects her melancholic, miserable state. We've got the analeptic shift. So analepsis, that's another structural method to explore this juxtaposition, and notice how the student here is just putting in these quick little quotations to indicate the bit of the text that is being talked about. Sometimes just sticking them in brackets afterwards, you know, not wasting loads and loads of time with quotations, just showing the examiner which part of the extract they're talking about. And notice in that third paragraph, Mansfield employs analepsis to explore this juxtaposition further. The student doesn't quote everything. She began to think about, you know, ... You don't have to quote entire sentences. There's no point. And we've got a really good effect there. The fact this analepsis, then Rosabelle begins reflecting on all the awful customers that she's had during the day. The student then indicates a section of dialogue. Again, that's a structural feature. We move into a section of dialogue. It might just sound quite descriptive, but that's what it is. That's the structural thing that's happening there. We pick up again on Rosabelle's lack of agency. Nice little word of these peaks here. Rosabelle's frustration peaks when the girl demands that she acts as her model. We've got a shift in tone when Rosabelle becomes more angry and frustrated. Again, the shift in tone, that's a structural method. Rosabelle is taunted by a repeating pattern of the nearness of the luxury that she is unable to grasp. This is a beautiful bit with the hat that she cannot own echoing. So something that happened before is being echoed, it's been repeated. Her blurred and misty vision of the jewellery shots from earlier in the extract. That's again showing that motif that works through the piece. But this student doesn't call it a motif. They've already used the word motif. They call it a thematic thread. A thematic thread, a theme that's threaded throughout the piece. And then we've got the circularity mentioned at the end, taking us back to the idea that Rosabelle had to make the choice between food and luxury, whereas the girl doesn't. The answer is, how does the student do? They do fantastically. They've done the coat hanger phrase in a slightly different way to the way that we would, absolutely recommend, but they've still done the same things. They talk about structure and narrative voice first, and they come up with an overall effect of those things, this sense of her being trapped and not having any agency, any power in her life. They then pick up on a series of structural methods. We've got the odd quote where necessary, and all of it referring back to that coat hanger or those two coat hanger sentences at the start. So very good answer, an easy 8 out of 8 this would get. And to be honest, you could probably pull out 3 or 4 of those structural bits and this would still get 8 out of 8 because it is a very strong answer. Okay, let's move on. Right, bit of a retrieval activity for you. Pause the recording, try and get yourself increasingly familiar with these structural methods. Okay, again, I hope you did this rather than just listening to what comes next, because it's by trying to retrieve this information that you will put it into your long-term memory. So events described in the order they happen, well, that's chronological. Analepsis, of course, is flashback. Prolepsis is flash forward. Foreshadowing is a hint of something that will happen in the future. Pathetic fallacy, where the setting reflects what is going on, often the weather, but please remember it's not always the weather. We have perspective. We talked a lot in the Rosabelle extract about these thematic threads and motifs. We've got circularity or circular structure or a circular narrative. Juxtaposition, when two things are set up in opposition to each other. You might, in your coat hanger sentence, have a regular, stable, cohesive, chronological narrative, or it might be irregular, unstable, and fragmented. These are all the kinds of things that you might look at. These are all the types of structural methods that you might reference. So let's do some more retrieval. I'll ask you a question. You see if you can come up with the answer. So first question, what do you write first in a paper 1 question 3 answer? Okay, hopefully you've said that you write a coat hanger sentence. So what do you include in your coat hanger sentence? Hopefully here you've said, hopefully you've paused the recording and you've perhaps scribbled down some answers. If not, do that now. Okay, hopefully you've scribbled down that you do effectively 3 things. You talk about the overall structure, you talk about the narrative voice, and you talk about why those 2 things are interesting. In other words, the overall effect or meaning of the piece. What do you do next? Well, the thing that you do next is you pick out any other structural methods you found and you write about them. You quote if you can, but that won't always be possible, and you write about the effect. And of course the effect is always going to be linked back to that coat hanger sentence. Little review of the formula here for you. This is just a repeat of what has come earlier. Okay. In these last few slides, we're just going to look at some advice from AQA, the examination board, and then we're going to look at some other extracts that you can have a go at yourself. Every year after the summer exams and indeed the November exams, the exam board creates something called an examiner's report, and that is a summary of the themes and that examiners have seen across the country of what students have done well and what students have done badly. They always publish this report in the late summer, early or sort of autumn, after the exams, and it's one of the things that as teachers we always go to kind of figure out, are we still teaching this question well? Do we still know what we're doing? Has anything changed from the exam board? So let's have a look at some advice from AQA. A significant number of students continue to make overgeneralized comments, interest the reader, makes the reader want to read on, which do not show any understanding of the effect of a particular structural feature and cannot be credited. The key to answering this question is to concentrate on why the detail selected is effective at that specific point in the text. Well, I'll try not to get too angry here. A significant number of students continue to make overgeneralized comments like interest the reader, makes the reader want to read on. Well, why do you think they might be doing that, AQA? Do you think they might be doing that because you've written a rubbish question where you have used the word interesting? So these poor students up and down the country go in, they read the question, they see the word interesting. What do they write about? They write about why it's interesting. So I'd say you kind of got what you've asked for there, AQA. But it's interesting, isn't it, that AQA pick up on this as being something that students typically get wrong. Now, what I hope you can see here is that the formula we're advising you to follow, particularly with that coat hanger sentence, is a great way of trying to avoid that pitfall. But specifically, it's worth thinking about how we stop ourselves making these kind of non-comments about the effect of a particular structural method. And if anyone's looked at the recorded lesson on paper 1 question 2, I've said some similar things in there about language methods or language techniques and devices. When you've identified a method, whether it's a structural method or a language method, the best way to think about the effect is to kind of try and sort of think a step back from the method a bit. Maybe don't think about the method, think about the overall piece that you're reading. And think particularly about the characters, the setting, and the plot. Now I've put theme in here as well. That, to be honest, is a bit more difficult. But if you always ask yourself, look, this method that I'm looking at, how does it change or add to my understanding of the character? How does it change or add to my understanding of the setting? How does it change or add to my understanding of the plot? If you ask yourself that question, you will generally find it much easier to talk about the effect, and you'll talk about the effect in a much more specific way. And if you think about the answer we looked at just now for Rosabelle, every structural technique that student identified, they were linking to Rosabelle's circumstance, Rosabelle's situation. In the case of the pathetic fallacy, the kind of tone or mood of the setting and how that reflected Rosabelle's melancholic and miserable state of mind. If you constantly try and link things back to either the character, the setting, or the plot, the story, then you are going to be doing well. And using those words, those transition words, and again, if this is new to you, go back to paper 1 question 2, and I give you a whole bunch of words you can use. Here are 4: suggesting, implying, echoing, invoking. Okay, we come on now to a few other ones that you can look at. Here we've got another Catherine Mansfield text. This is not an AQA one, but have a look at Crescent Bay. What I suggest you do, well no, I'll demand you do really, try writing an answer. There is a model answer on the next slide, don't look at it. Have a go yourself and then compare it to the model answer on the next slide. Okay. Here is a model answer. What I suggest you do now is you print off this model answer, highlight the coat hanger phrase. Once you've done that, go through, underline every structural method. Once you've done that, in a different colour, underline every transition word. Transition words, things like suggesting, creating, imbuing, invoking, echoing, mirroring, furthering, heightening, those words. and then go and highlight every single effect. And then ask yourself, is this a good answer? What mark do you think this would get? Right, last slide coming up. Here is a source. Again, this isn't one from AQA, this is one that I found from another school. Have a look at this source, print it off, and try and write yourself an answer to it. Now, depending where you are in your English language journey, if you're halfway through year 10 and you're probably only doing this question for the second or third time, what I would suggest you do is you probably take much longer than 10 minutes. Do it as an open book. In other words, have your resources in front of you, print this off, go through those 15 questions, have a look at the models, take a bit more time over it. If you take an hour over this question, but you're learning the process for answering the question, that is time well spent. If it's February or March of year 11 and you're about to go into the final exam, you probably need to be printing this off and give yourself 10 minutes to read the source, but then give yourself 10 minutes to write your answer, because you now need to be doing it to time. Either way, once you've done the answer, take the source and take your answer to your teacher and get them to have a quick look at it for you. They won't probably be able to mark it fully, but they'll be able to read through it and give you some indication of where you're doing well and where you could improve. Once you've done that, if you want more questions, your teacher, we have a bank of every single past paper from AQA. There are also lots of other ones available online. They are hopefully on your Teams page. If your teacher hasn't put them on your Teams page, do go and ask your teacher to do that. We've got them shared centrally as an English team at County, so it's very easy for your teacher to upload those to your Teams page. Please ask them to come and speak to someone else in the department if they're unsure about how to go about doing that. That is the end of paper 1 question 3. Thank you very much.